Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Edick. I'm president of the San Diego World Affairs Council. Thank you for taking time to join us today for a very interesting program. The San Diego World Affairs Council educates and engages San Diegans in international relations, global issues, and cultural understanding. Stay tuned for additional in-person programming as the spring moves along. Come to our website at www.sdwac.org for more information on future programming. And now to move on to today's program, titled Coups, Chaos, and Conflict: How Cold War Interventions Led to the 2026 Iran War. And quite an adventure we've all embarked on here. Historians may well mark February 28th, 2026 as the day the world crossed a line into a new era when the US and Israel launched a wide-scale military operation against Iran. However, this war aimed at regime change is not the first American military engagement with Iran. Rather, it is embedded in a history that began during World War II, which can be characterized as the beginning of American hybrid warfare in Iran, establishing a playbook for Cold War coups. Some argue the Cold War began when Truman objected to Soviet troops that remained in Iran after 1945. The 1953 Anglo-American coup that reinstalled the Shah served as a precedent for the 1954 overthrow of Arbenz in Guatemala. The first coup in Iran for oil, the second in Guatemala for bananas, creating the term Banana Republic. The U.S. remained in Iran, helping Iranian pilots fly the F-14s, contributing to the nationalist F-14s being aircraft of the Top Gun fame, as many of you know. Those trainings took place on Iranian soil, contributing to nationalist sentiment that led to the 1979 revolution. The U.S. engaged in military operations against the Islamic Republic from the failed 1980 rescue attempt following the seizure of hostages at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Some of you will remember that tragic failure, the helicopter accidents in the deserts south of Tehran during the Carter administration. In addition, there was the 1988 downing of an Iranian Airbus by a U.S. Navy ship as the Cold War came to an end. The method of hybrid warfare demonstrates a long history of this practice before it entered the political lexicon and its application to Russia and its Gerasimov Doctrine, combining traditional military force with cyberattacks, disinformation, and economic pressure. This form of American cold hybrid war continues into the 21st century with the so-called 12-day war of July 2025, the January 26 raid in Venezuela, and the February 2026 war with Iran. Today's presentation is by Dr. Ibrahim Al-Marashi. Dr. Al-Marashi is an associate professor of history at California State University at San Marcos. He serves as the advisory board member of San Diego State University's ISCOR program. He's also a visiting faculty member at the American College of the Mediterranean. My French isn't strong enough to handle the name of this particular town, but in France. He also is a visiting faculty member at the Department of International Relations at Central European University in Vienna, Austria, and teaches corporate intelligence at the International University of Monaco. His publications include Iraq's Armed Forces, an Analytical History, that's in 2008. In 2017, he wrote The Modern History of Iraq, and a couple of years ago wrote A Concise History of the Middle East. Some of you will recall that large chunks of Dr. Al-Marashi's PhD thesis were copied into a report Tony Blair's administration used as justification for joining the U.S. in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ibrahim Al-Marashi. Ibrahim, take it away.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you for also mentioning the plagiarism in 2003, because that's going to set up this lecture. Partly, are we repeating the mistakes of the 2003 Iraq War? Uh, Dave, I've had a long history with San Diego World Affairs Council. I've given lectures on the 2003 Iraq War, 20 years after it happened. I've given lectures on ISIS. And here we are now talking. ISIS emerged in 2016. Here we are 10 years later, and another war has broken out. What I will try to do is give a historical overview that links all these events together. Now, what will happen in this case is we will begin with a presentation. If you have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat, and then our host, Dave, will be that's kind enough to moderate those questions. So during the lecture, if you have any questions, just feel free to type them. And without further ado, I will begin with the PowerPoint. Okay, so I want to give a shout out, of course, to San Diego State University and the ISCOR program. That's the International Security and Conflict Resolution Program, and Professor Cheryl O'Brien, as well as Professor Pierre Asselin and the Center for War and Society for co-hosting this event. So what I will do, let me just get this into the full screen, is, of course, when talking about an event on Iran, people always wonder what is my background and how am I connected to this region. So basically, I'll tell you a story, and the story I'm going to tell you of my personal background is very much a story of the entire region. I go back to an article I wrote in 2014, which dealt with the immediate emergence of ISIS. I juxtaposed this with another article from Simon Tolkien talking about his grandfather, J.R.R. Tolkien. And basically, these two articles are a good overview of what happened after World War I. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit as a way of dealing with his trauma from the First World War. What did I write about? Well, what I'm going to show you in this article is relevant for understanding what's happening in Iran. You see, when ISIS emerged, everyone was blaming it on the Sykes-Picot borders that carved up the Middle East. And I argued it was a much more profound than that. It wasn't just the borders. It was the minute the British stepped foot in Iraq, trying to dictate to the Iraqis their affairs, that the Iraqis revolted. You see, tell me if this refrain sounds familiar. The British came into Iraq and told the people they had just conquered, "We've freed you from your dictators. Now it's up to you to take your destiny in your own hands." And of course, the people who had just been conquered by the British did the exact opposite. They picked up rifles and tried to expel the foreign occupier, creating back then what was the insurgency. An insurgency broke out in 1920, yet for some reason the Americans thought in 2003 they would avoid an insurgency. It's not that history repeats, that's too deterministic. It's the question, do policymakers ever learn from history? In the 2003 case, no. And I'm arguing in 2026. No policymaker in the current administration is really learning from the 2003 Iraq War. The important thing is when the British invaded Iraq, my grandfather picked up a rifle to fight them. He was, of course, what we would call an Iranian. If you look at his passport, sure, he was born in the territory of what is Iraq, but he would have been, for all intents and purposes, an Iranian, a Persian. Okay. I say this just so you that understand that do you see how the invasion of Iraq involved its neighbor and vice versa, the regional linkages? So just to tell you, yes, my grandfather would have been born in what is today Iraq. He fought the British and he had to flee. And upon fleeing, he needed his passport to, and this is kind of just his passport from when he fled. And upon fleeing, he went to this place. Now, I show you this just so it demonstrates how my grandfather had to ask for permission to go back to Iraq because he revolted against the people who were ruling it. My grandfather ended up moving to Zanzibar. And Zanzibar is, of course, a place on the East African coast. And of course, my father was born there. And I don't have a picture of my father, but I do have a picture of my father's neighbor. His name was Farrokh Bulsara. And of course, Farrokh Bulsara in Zanzibar, this is a picture of Farrokh Bulsara when he grew up. And of course, he would later go and leave to the UK and establish the band Queen. His name, you would know him, is Freddie Mercury. Farrokh Bulsara was a Zanzibari, but he also practiced an ancient Iranian religion known as Zoroastrianism. So, of course, yeah, my grandfather is ethnically Persian. So, not only was Freddie Mercury originally of Iranian heritage, Zoroastrian heritage, of course, so is your speaker as well. Nevertheless, culturally, historically, I studied more Iraq but nevertheless, because these countries are so linked, I also studied Iraq in detail. Now, I want you to look at what Bernie Sanders wrote here about the repetition of what got us into these wars. Okay. Sun Tzu famously said, all warfare is based on deception. Somebody also said history is the study of unintended consequences. And this is not history repeating, but Trump not learning from history. Those two phrases come from yours truly, your speaker. And this is what I'm going to be talking about today, how history informs this particular conflict. Okay. So this is actually coming from the TV HBO series Dune. Humanity's greatest weapon is the lie. And basically, what we're going to look at is what were the misdirections, deceptions, or lies that got us into the 2003 Iraq War, and then ask, um, is this what is happening again? Okay, that is getting us into the 2026 Iran war. Of course, when Bernie Sanders refers to Vietnam, he's referring to the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that got America into 10 years of war in Vietnam. In 1965, of course, in 1955, the US had already entered Iran surreptitiously. Okay. The connection between the series Dune, if you're familiar with the series, I highly recommend you watch it because, of course, the planet Arrakis sounds a lot like Iraq. And I think Frank Herbert deliberately chose that alliteration. Nevertheless, let's look at the following. Trump is making U.S. intelligence parrot his line on Iran. It echoes Bush's invasion of Iraq. When was this article written? In the summer of 2025. In other words, we should have been asking what got the US involved in the bombing of Iran back in 2025. And without kind of an interrogation of this intervention, I would argue Trump realized he could intervene again in 2026 and face very little domestic backlash. So when I talk about this, what is the US intelligence on Iraq that's being referred to? And just to give you a very good case, I thought I would bring you back in time to 2023. Of course, if you look at this Orwell sign, it's not an exaggeration. I want to show you this video of what happened back in 2023 that involved yours truly. I'm just going to make sure, hopefully the sound will be working. And if not, David, you just turn on your mic if you can't hear it. But let's go. We're back in 2023. And this is an example of some of the flawed intelligence that got the US into the 2003 Iraq War.
The government's carefully coordinated propaganda offensive took an embarrassing hit tonight after Downing Street was accused of plagiarism. The target is an intelligence dossier released on Monday and heralded by none other than US Secretary of State Colin Powell at the United Nations yesterday. Channel 4 News has learned that the bulk of this 19-page document was copied from 3 different articles, one written by a graduate student. Our defence specialist Julian Rush has the details.
I will try to
On Monday, the day before the US Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the UN, Downing Street published its latest paper on Iraq. It gives the impression of being an up-to-the-minute intelligence-based analysis, and Mr. Powell was fulsome in his praise.
I would call my colleagues' attention to the fine paper that the United Kingdom distributed yesterday, which describes in exquisite detail Iraqi deception activities.
Published on the Number 10 website and called Iraq, its infrastructure of concealment, deception and intimidation, it outlines the structure of Saddam's intelligence organizations. But it made familiar reading to a Cambridge academic.
Many of the words and phrases that it used I recalled from another context. So I searched around the other articles that I'd read on Iraq's organisations, its military and security organisations, and realised that large sections of the British government's dossier were actually copied.
Copied from here, an article last September in a small journal, the Middle East Review of International Affairs. Its author, Ibrahim Al-Marashi, a postgraduate student from Monterey in California.
The document, the British government dossier, is 19 pages long. Most of pages 6 to 16 are copied directly from that document.
Word for word?
Word for word. Even the grammatical errors and the typographical mistakes are copied.
Large sections do indeed appear verbatim. This, for example, 6 paragraphs long on Saddam's special security organization. The exact same words are in the Californian student's paper. Of military intelligence, Al-Marashi writes, the head of military intelligence generally did not have to be a relative of Saddam's immediate family nor a Tikriti. Saddam appointed Sabir Abdelaziz al-Duri as head. Note the comma after appointed. Downing Street paraphrases the first sentence, but the second is cut and pasted, complete with the same grammatical error. Academics take plagiarism seriously. It's intellectual theft. Downing Street didn't ask for permission to reproduce the work, which is not current, but actually an historical analysis of the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait before the last Gulf War.
He's writing his PhD thesis on the operation of Iraqi forces inside Kuwait, and his primary source of information is documents captured from the Iraqi government in 1991. The information, therefore, that he is using is 12 years old, and he acknowledges this in his article. The British government, when it transplants that information into its own dossier, does not make that acknowledgement. So it is presented as current information about Iraq's current security services, when really the information that it is using are some 12 years old.
Downing Street copied from 2 other articles from the magazine Jane's Intelligence Review. Its editor is happy to be quoted, less happy at the selective way some parts were edited.
What you need to look at is exactly how it's been compiled and collated. And the questions that you're asking about, has certain things been selected for spin, are right questions to be asked.
In several places, Downing Street edits the originals to make more sinister reading. Number 10 says the main intelligence agency is spying on foreign embassies in Iraq. The original read monitoring foreign embassies in Iraq. And the provocative role of supporting terrorist organizations in hostile regimes is weaker in the originals, aiding opposition groups in hostile regimes. And an original phrase describing a group made up of bullies and country bumpkins is in Number 10's version just bullies. Editing to make Saddam's apparatus look more terrifying, raising questions about the way Number 10 is spinning the justification for war.
Julian Rush. Well, I called Downing Street for reaction. No minister was available, and intriguingly, actually the Tory opposition didn't want to talk about it either. Downing Street offered this statement. Our report was put together by a range of government officials. The report makes this clear. The contents were drawn from a number of sources, including intelligence material. First paragraph only, I gather. The report does not identify or credit any sources, nor does it claim exclusivity on its contents. We consider the text as published accurate. The Downing Street spokesman would not be drawn on whether this included the typos and spelling mistakes.
Okay, so the point of this was not just to show you all my poor use of commas. but to make 3 points. And the points are the following. Number one, I was writing about the 1991 Gulf War. My research was plagiarized for the 2003 Iraq War. In 2026, the US has entered its third Gulf War. And I think this says a lot. We have to call it what it is. Second, why is it important to link all 3 wars? And this is what I'm doing as a historian. The 91 Gulf War only lasted 6 weeks, relatively short for a war. But it left unresolved business that eventually resulted in Saddam's survival and the 2003 war. The 2003 war only lasted 3 weeks, but that too left unresolved business. Saddam was not immediately captured, and in the chaos, a terrorist organization emerged that still exists to this very day, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Trump promises this war will end in 4 weeks. Nevertheless, what is history showing us? Middle East wars might be short, but their ramifications unfold over a long period. Second, let's not forget Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda emerged primarily to object to America's deployment and bombing of Iraq in 1991. Bin Laden and his strike against America in 2001 happened exactly a decade later. And that's what the political scientist Chalmers Johnson would have called blowback. Okay. So you're seeing this from the long, over the long durée, the problem of this. What's the next lesson to take away from the plagiarism is the following. At least Colin Powell and the Bush administration made an effort to sell the war to the American public. And they tried to bring in an ally, the UK. In this third Gulf War, not only was there any attempt to even sell or justify this war to the American public, their ally in the third Gulf War is Israel, basically bringing in the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Gulf War and combining them. So yes, there is continuities between Iraq and Iran. And what I want to show is this. Look what the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is not Tony Blair. Look what he said when he refused to get involved in this third Gulf War. We've learned the lessons of Iraq. And my argument is the US hasn't. Now, I want to go to the Iranian perspective, and in this case, I'm going to go to the Iranian graphic artist Marjan Satrapi and her graphic novel known as Persepolis. And you have to understand, look at the Iranian perspective of how long the Iranian plateau, the Persian culture has been the victim of history. We've had 2,500 years of tyranny, her father said, the Shahs, then the Arab invasion from the West in the 7th century in a battle known as Qadisiyah, followed by the Mongolian invasion from the East in the 1250s, and finally modern imperialism, the British and theirs Uncle Sam. And then let's not forget the Iran-Iraq War as well, when Iraq invaded. And of course, it was the precursor of British Petroleum, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, that around 1908, the British became linked to Iranian affairs when oil was discovered in the south of Iran near the city of Abadan. Of course, then it was the British Navy's decision under Winston Churchill to shift from coal power to petroleum that forever connected British geopolitics, its infamous Navy, to domestic matters in Iran, literally underneath Iran's soil. And of course, with the British so involved in Iranian affairs, they looked with great consternation when the ruler of Iran, the Shah, Reza Pahlavi, on the eve of World War II was making overtures to Germany, Nazi Germany, and I demonstrate this with an image of a German Junker plane on Iranian soil. So the British got involved in their first regime change, removing the father, Reza Pahlavi, and replacing him with his son. And in this case, the British intervention says a lot. The British didn't kill Reza Pahlavi. They simply ensured a transition, replacing the father with the son. Not a decapitation, just a change in regime. Okay. Now, during World War II, if you look at this map, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, there was only one way that the Soviets could be supplied. And I'm so grateful, my professor, colleague from Spain, IE University, Susana, I'm glad you're here. I will, because of course she shares an interest in Soviet, Russian, and Slavic affairs. The only way that the Soviet Union survived was to get weapons shipped via Iran. Crimea was under German control, you see, and there was no way you could get weapons there. Leningrad was being besieged by Germany. And of course, sending weapons via the Pacific, the US couldn't do that. That was a Japanese combat zone. There was only one way, and that was through the ports of Iran. And then they would be trucked into the Caucasus. And thus, long lines of American GIs drove these trucks, particularly the most important one, the Studebaker truck, was so valuable to Stalin's war effort. And they had simple orders. If you saw anyone crossing the road, any Iranians, any locals, run them over. Nothing could stop the supply convoy. And as a result, with the American presence in World War II, Iran's most famous patriotic song, A Iran, was written. Okay. A Iran was a nationalist song that to this day evokes emotions in any Iranian. It was never the official anthem. It was the unofficial anthem. And basically it was written by an Iranian poet who saw an American GI beat an Iranian grocer. A grocery guy. And so basically this was its response. And to this day, this song, is perhaps one of the only things that all Iranians can agree on, Persians can agree on. But anyway, in 1953, Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil industry, wresting control from the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, otherwise today known as BP. And this brought the first coup, which involved a newly formed organization known as the Central Intelligence Agency. The U.S. Was able to pull off a coup in Iran, and from that point onwards, the U.S. got a greater share of Iran's oil. But I would argue that events all the way in 2026 still can be traced back to this moment in history. The 1953 coup, I would argue, was an example of hybrid warfare. You see, hybrid warfare is often used to refer to the way Russia conducts warfare today. But if you look at all of these, in 1953, spreading information or misinformation to change opinions and actions, the CIA basically got a lot of Iranian writers on the payroll. They paid people to protest. And they were going to arm 10,000 members of the Qashqai tribe to fight Mohammad Mossadegh. The Shah had fled. They didn't even have to do that. Mossadegh's government collapsed when the military came on the streets, when people were paid to protest. This was an example of irregular warfare, but I would argue from 1953, then taking us to the formation of the Islamic Republic, all of these have been used by the US against Iran. In this case, it's the Islamic Republic of Iran. Economic, sanctions, political, influencing leaders, cyber, think Stuxnet, that malicious program that destroyed Iranian centrifuges, and sabotage, directly damaging critical infrastructure against Stuxnet is a good example. The 1953 coup, in my opinion, was that seminal moment that influenced an obscure Iranian cleric, at that time very relatively young, Ayatollah Khomeini. 1953 linked Iran to the US, and from that point onwards, the US became Iran's primary ally and began sending it weapons. Khomeini's most prominent speech was made when a status of forces agreement was signed between Iran and the US. No American GI, again, could be prosecuted by Iranian law. Now you have to understand, why is this important? These are American helicopters being sold to the Air Force of the Iranian Shah. These were F-14s. And who maintains this equipment? Who teaches the Iranians how to fly them? Well, it had to be American soldiers, you see. And this is what Khomeini first used as a rallying call. The 1953 coup, now the SOFA agreement, was among the many of the charges he made against the Iranian government. Let's not forget, Iran's nuclear aspirations began not with the Islamic Republic, but with not only was the Shah buying F-14s, he was also buying nuclear plants at the same time. So you do see a lot of continuities. Of course, the Shah was overthrown, and this begins the first case of U.S. hybrid warfare. I would example the first time the U.S. forces were on Iranian soil under the Islamic Republic. It was to rescue Iranian American hostages in the U.S. embassy that were being held by Iranian students. That operation was a failure, and thus the superpower during the Cold War, the United States, was unable to rescue these hostages from Iran, leading to the defeat of President Jimmy Carter, one of the factors, and of course, ushering President Ronald Reagan's rule. So these are images of the failed operation. By the way, this failed operation led to the creation of American Special Forces to prevent accidents from like this happening. And then what happened next, 1980 to 1988? Iran endured the longest war of the 20th century, the Iran-Iraq War. And what the Americans provided to Iran became one of the Islamic Republic's most valuable weapons. But nevertheless, Iran was bombarded by weapons of mass destruction. They were bombarded with chemical weapons, and the whole world turned a blind eye. It's an important precedent to mention that Iran was fighting this war alone. Okay. The whole world was behind Iraq. Both the Soviet Union and France and the US wanted Iraq to win, and thus creating the monster. And another example of blowback, the rise of Saddam Hussein, who more or less came out victorious of the 1988 Iran-Iraq war, and Iran learned an important lesson. We could get bombarded by weapons of mass destruction, and the world will say nothing. In fact, they will help Iraq deliver these weapons. And this is what I argue would explain Iran's need for a deterrent. From a geopolitical perspective, would Iran have been bombed with chemical weapons had it had nuclear weapons? Would Saddam Hussein even invaded? Okay. Here's the Strait of Hormuz, a piece of geopolitical choke point, important now and it was important then. And it was for that reason the U.S. Navy deployed to the Gulf as of 1987 to 1988 to protect Gulf shipping. Okay. And during that deployment, here's an image of the U.S. Vincennes, which was stationed in San Diego. It was deployed to the Gulf, and it accidentally downed an Iranian Airbus, killing about 270 people, 270 innocent people who had no role in this war. In the Iranian psyche, that accident, and then accidentally another downing of an Iranian aircraft. This one is Ukraine International Airlines leaving Tehran airport in 2020, mistaken for an American aircraft. And then undoubtedly the bombing of a girls' school in Iran. These are all collective traumas, regardless of your politics in Iran. These are civilians that were caught in the crossfire. And then the Cold War ended. And I use this map for a reason, okay? Because if you're going to be consuming media, you're going to be seeing a lot of maps. And Iran is usually pushed to the side and putting the Gulf and Saudi Arabia in the center. I like this map a lot more. Ironically, it's produced by the CIA. It's a CIA map. They're declassified, but I think the CIA map is much more valuable than the maps we see in the mainstream media because it puts Iran at the center, not of the Middle East, but of a region known as Southwest Asia. And I argue the Middle East is, it deliberately makes us see the region in a biased way. West Asia or Southwest Asia is much more better to understand how Iran is central to South Asia, Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Eurasia, and then West Asia itself, the Levant, going towards Egypt. Okay. Why is this map important? Because it also shows how India, Pakistan, and China meet. Okay. And it's a reminder, what do those three countries have in common? They're all three nuclear powers. And in an environment like that, where you have three powers that are nuclear on Iran's border, and let's not forget, Pakistan and India almost went to war in 2025. If you look at it that way, then you understand kind of Iran's geopolitical position. Then if you go to Armenia and Azerbaijan, remember in 2022, this was an active war zone on Iran's border. And then if you go to Turkey, let's not forget, that's a member of NATO. And then if a map like this makes you realize Ukraine is not too far from Iran. Okay. And of course, let's not forget Iraq was more or less under US soldiers were in Iraq since 2003. And then, of course, in neighboring Afghanistan. This gives you not only an image of how Iran sees the world, but also how important Iran is to, it is the fulcrum, I would argue, of Eurasia. And this is, you could get a good idea of on the eve of the 2003 Iraq War, both pipelines and the perspective of Iran being kind of hemmed in by US forces. And then let's not forget, in 2003, when Saddam fell relatively quickly, the man who was just killed over the weekend, Ayatollah Khamenei, and this is a forgotten episode in history, actually reached out to the US and offered a grand bargain, a grand deal, where the nascent nuclear program, support for proxies, could be negotiated. It's a forgotten episode in history. And the US under George W. Bush said, no, we don't negotiate with evil. You see, coming out of the victory of the 2003 Iraq War, the US really thought Iran would be next. And that was another major opportunity. From 1953, that set of these events in motion, 2003 was the other great missed opportunity. So, a nuclear program developed in Iran, okay, at these various sites, and then later more sites would be developed. But this was the original. This is Iran's nuclear program pre-mid 2002, right before the Iraq War, when the revelations was the program was there. Other sites such as Fordo, this underground fortified site, would be revealed much later. And I go back to this 2006 article. Why would Iran pursue a nuclear weapon? Well, you get the past trauma, okay? Even though Iran, never admitted they would ever do this. But even the pursuit of a nuclear weapons, this author from The Guardian says it all. Back then, for President Ahmadinejad, and the heirs to Khomeini, the nuclear issue is about national pride. It was nuclear nationalism. It's about Western recognition of the legitimacy of the revolution, the wrongs of the past, aspirations of the future, respect. Problem is not complicated. Sooner or later, the US, Britain, and the rest will have to stop demonizing Iran and start dealing with it on equal terms. And the closest that ever occurred to was the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. And I would argue it succeeded, it was working, and tragically, it could have been 10 years in 2025 of it in place had President Trump not withdrawn from it in 2018, seeking to undermine the legacy of his predecessor. And that was seeking the legacy of Barack Obama, trying to renegotiate a better deal. And this was a mistake by withdrawing from it. Okay. Basically, he told the Iranians, no deal can ever be trusted with the US. And this is what I would argue he reaped what he sowed. This was the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. I just love this mistake that Fox News made because I keep on arguing the difference between Iran and Iraq is not just the letter and in Q, that both these issues are kind of very much linked. Ken Klippenstein argued back in March 2025 that Trump began his war with Iran. You see, we keep on saying now, is this the beginning of a forever war with Iran? But this article got it right. Okay. There was a low-intensity American war with Iran that began as far as 2025. There were indications that a strike was inevitable, that the planes were getting ready for the first round in the summer of 2025, and now this war that began on the last day of February. Back then, this is what was struck. A single raid to destroy all these sites. Trump declared the mission worked. These sites were obliterated. But then, and of course, those strikes were based on intelligence, that there was an immediate threat from Iran. Just like we have this unspecified intelligence that said there was an immediate threat from Iran on the eve of this round of conflict. What is interesting is this. What is making this conflict unique is, and if you go on to Twitter, I'm sorry, old mistakes, if you go on to X, this is kind of really the future of warfare, is not only the physical bombs that are flying, but the digital bombs. Okay. The role of deep fakes in this conflict I found interesting. This is from the June War. And it's going to be quite interesting what gets produced in this round of the conflict.
In the shadow of the armed conflict between Israel and Iran, another battle is raging, online. Over the past 2 weeks, the information war has intensified, flooding the internet with misleading content. AI-manipulated videos, deepfakes, and recycled footage from past conflicts. DW Fact Check investigated, and here are 3 recent examples you should know about. A 16-second video shows a bird's-eye view of a city in ruins. A location stamp in Arabic reads Tel Aviv. This clip has gone viral, shared by the Iranian media outlet Tehran Times on X, calling it Doomsday in Tel Aviv, and reposted across TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. However, it is AI-generated and the details prove it. Look at the cars that are merging together. Also, the poor quality as well as the unidentifiable objects on the rooftops are indicators. The shadows are inconsistent. On the left building, they angle differently than on the right. This video claims to show Israelis protesting against their country's war on Iran. The video has been shared on TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook. But again, it's AI generated. And here are some hints. A flag suddenly appears out of nowhere. The crowd looks oddly artificial, and there is a watermark from Google's AI tool Veo 3. This video claims to show the US attack on an Iranian nuclear facility. However, a Google Lens search leads us to this content creator that posted the exact same video days before the US announced its involvement in the war. In the caption, the creator describes the footage as an AI-generated video. Again, there are clear signs in the video itself as well. There is no shockwave or reaction from the person filming, and the smoke rises far too slowly for a real explosion. These are just 3 of many examples flooding the internet since the beginning of the war. So how can you protect yourself?
And these were shared. This was what one of my co-writers, Tanya Gutsuzian, says is the geopolitics of misinformation. And just go to X, and on both sides it's quite amazing just how much is being generated as we speak. Anyway, this was in November 2025. Trump, gloating about his success in the summer of 2025. Of course, which then begs the question, if he was claiming victory back then, why another round? And this comes back to us being skeptical consumers of information from any government. Okay. The tragedy is the following. The same places where bullets are flying and bombs are flying, temperatures reached in the Gulf, particularly in some of these islands, up to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. These are the highest temperatures ever recorded in human history. The tragedy in all of this is, instead of, all this money being invested in nuclear plants in Iran, I argue the real plants that should have been built were desalinization plants. Iran's government might barely survive politically, but I would argue, tragically, will it survive environmentally at the same time? If you want more information about this, I would recommend my article in The Conversation that came out yesterday that gives all of this in a single narrative in 1,000 words. Just go ahead and Google it. Here's my email. And if you want to just take a picture, if you have further questions, but I will stop here. That's an overview of how we got here. And I wanted to give a history. I wanted to give history, historical context. Now, of course, as a historian, projecting into the future is a bit of a perilous task, but nevertheless, I'll try to do my best in the Q&A. Thank you for all of you who came. I see 67 participants. I think that's quite a lot for for Sidwak, and I appreciate all of you coming. And David, I'll leave it up to you to moderate the Q&A.
Ibrahim, thank you for a very interesting presentation and giving some historical background, some reminders that history didn't start yesterday. There are some, if you have questions, ladies and gentlemen, please write them in the webinar chat or in the Q&A box. There are a few already, or at least raise your hand. Oh, wow. Okay. So the first question from Mohammed Raz of Pakistan. He wants to know your personal opinion of Spanish government about their recent stance on U.S. versus Iran attacks.
So, as I made a shout out to one of my colleagues from Spain, Susanna, of course, I work in Spain. I've lived in Spain for quite a long period of my life. I go back and forth to Spain. Personally, that is the only, government in Europe that I could take some consolation and pride in with its stance. I think it's one of the most brave stance ever taken in Europe, standing up to kind of the hegemonic and bullying language coming out from the US. I think it is just it's about which countries are really willing to basically raise the alarm about the potential dangers. And, just for that reason, I mean, I think the Spanish government has been one of the best in terms of its, the recognition of Palestine. I think, you have to realize a lot of these European countries, they have an imperial colonial past. Spain, not so much. But in doing this, I think Spain has achieved a kind of soft power at a time where, when the world is probably worried about kind of US unilateralism in Venezuela, Greenland, in the US, I think Spain's position has been very courageous. And so, I'm just personally, I'm American and British, but now, I really just want to get a Spanish citizenship. I might as well just because finally I see a government that I see myself in. So anyway, thank you from Pakistan for attending this. But this is what I think is it was just one of the few world leaders who took a courageous stand. A member of NATO, basically saying that calling it for what it is, this could be a dangerous action.
Second question is, there are YouTube videos claiming Iranians are celebrating that the religious and military leaders have been killed. Is that correct?
So again, this goes back to that video I showed you of the deep fakes. We always have to question the anything we see that is digital, but nevertheless, I mean, I think that's relatively easy to answer. First of all, were there Iranians who were, and the reason the way I can answer this is quite easy as somebody who comes from Iraq, and I'll give you the answer here, is that perhaps some of us might have been glad to see a dictator like Saddam Hussein go, but nevertheless, we didn't want the US to remove him, number one. It should have been a job done by the Iraqis, and that the US would only make things worse. And I mean, the history proved, I mean, our fears right. Okay. So are there Iranians happy? Are they celebrating? Perhaps yes. If you see them on the street, I would always be skeptical because that's quite a dangerous thing to do when the government is so scared. But I mean, let's look at it this way. I mean, in January, you had Iranians desperate, deprived of their life savings, frustrated, and basically, the government used violence to disperse those protests. The same thing the Syrian government did back in 2011, and that alienated a lot of Syrians. Of course, there's going to be Iranians who are happy that the government that not only kind of destroyed their livelihood, but used violence during those protests, of people who are desperate. And let's not forget, there was a 2026 protest, the 2022 protest after the death of Mahsa Amini, a 2009 protest against a rigged election, a 1998 protest. Okay, so of course there's going to be Iranians happy. Are they going to be on the street celebrating? I don't know, maybe. Of course, there's going to be Iranians who would be happy. There are probably Iranians who genuinely love the supreme leader. And there are Iranians who are somewhere in between. Okay. Sure, this government, was corrupt. It called itself an Islamic Republic, but there was a lot of people who were corrupt within it. But is anything that's going to come next any better? Remember, it took 10 years for the government of more than 10 years for the Syrian government to get removed after they used force against protesters. And in its wake emerged ISIS, and the government that took power in Syria, let's not forget, is an Islamist government with a leader who had ties to Al-Qaeda. I think Syria is a very good example in Iran. Saddam got removed, and then we had ISIS come in its place. And so, of course, Iranians, this is their neighborhood. So, we have to understand all of this, that sure, there's Iranians who are happy. Some are just worried about their life at this point. So there's I'm sure, a variety of responses. But this goes back in the age of the digital. We always have to be skeptical of the information we see with our eyes. Good question.
Well, for sure, Iran is a large, complex society. Many different viewpoints are going to be found there. And one of the errors that can be made from a distance is to treat a society as a monolithic affair, that people see things either one way or another, or that a particular leader has absolute control or not. This is going to be one of the challenges going forward. Some additional questions. Dr. Ibrahim, thank you for a great lecture. Do you think the IDF's motivation for attacking Iran goes beyond the nuclear program? This person's seen online images of IDF uniforms depicting territory beyond Israel's borders. Does that hold any significance to what we're seeing?
Okay, so that's a question from Savvy, and then after that we have a question from Professor Hisham Fuad, both representing San Diego State. So thank you for joining, and maybe if I could get both of those. So Savvy, who is now doing her MA at University of San Diego, Hisham Fuad, a professor of economics at San Diego State University. Let me answer both of them. I think Israel's policy is not just about the nuclear program. Nor do I think is it really about having a democratic regime take power, because even if a democratic regime takes power, a democratic regime would also probably get elected with a lot of Iranians who resent Israel bombing it twice. Okay, so was it about destroying its nuclear program? I think it's much more than that. Was it about having a change in regime? I don't think that they would want a real democratic republic. I think, I hate to say it, it is to make Iran like Syria. It is to have the Iranian government perhaps collapse, because a government and become like Syria. And Syria was the frontline state that Israel feared the most after it signed its peace treaty with Egypt in 1979, Jordan in 1991. Okay. Syria was the strongest military in the region on Israel's border, and had a control over Hezbollah, and it collapsed. And that really, that decade of fighting, I think, ultimately benefited Israeli policy. And I mean, so of course, there's always multiple motivations when a state uses violence and goes to war. But to answer both of your questions, Savi and Hisham, is it just about the nuclear program? No, I think it really is to destabilize the greatest regional hegemon, the greatest threat to Israel. It was probably about destroying the ballistic missiles. The nuclear program, I think, really took a hard hit much earlier. So the easy question is, it goes much more to that. Perhaps Israel thought it could foment unrest amongst the Azeri Turkic population in Iran. Remember, there's more Azerbaijanis in Iran than in the Republic of Azerbaijan. Remember, the Republic of Azerbaijan is an Israeli ally. That would have worked towards Israel's advantage. To encourage Kurdish separatism would have worked to Israel's advantage. So the easy answer is it's much more than the nuclear program, absolutely.
Got it. So I'm going to step in.
To come to the US now, to answer your question, Hisham, then will Israel and America's goals diverge? Absolutely. Absolutely. In that, I'll just answer it from the political science literature. Trump and Netanyahu are arch realists. They work on the realist school. They will ultimately try to maximize their benefits. And when one sees a benefit, they will kind of abandon the other. Trump is probably going to think of his own survival in US domestic politics. Netanyahu is. And each one will make the decision based on their own survival. And so for that reason, yes, absolutely, their interests could diverge. If the US sees the war is not going well, Trump might try to get out of it much sooner than Netanyahu would have wanted.
I think there'll be some Tehran will have some role to play in how this all plays out. I want to step in here and talk a bit about the Kurdish question, if you will, for the region.
Donna was from Spain, was also asking about the different ethnic groups. So let's bring in the Kurds. Yeah.
So about a week before the war broke out, Trump's representative Tom Barak was in Erbil, along with, and this is being promoted big time in Israeli media, that Kurdish population in Western Iran, that the Kurds in northern Iraq, maybe even Kurds in Turkey, although that's highly doubtful, would be interested in participating in some sort of insurrection. It was interesting that in one of the more spectacular attacks in the first hours of the war, a counterattack, if you will, from Iran was on Erbil, hitting a U.S. base there and causing a weapons depot to explode. What is it about the Kurds in the region? How practical do you see this thinking about Kurdish in Iran creating an insurrection that would be the boots on the ground that the U.S. seems to want to avoid?
Okay, very good question. And first of all, so when we talk about the Kurds as an ethnic group, we also have to remember there are two different groups amongst the Kurds. In 1980, the Kurds of Iran really were hoping to get some kind of federal arrangement with the central government, and Ayatollah Khomeini refused. So they took up arms. And from 1980 to 1982, there was a sustained Kurdish uprising along with the Iraqi invasion. So Iran was fighting two wars. It was fighting the Iraqis as well as a Kurdish uprising. And it put down both. It expelled the Iraqis by 1982 and crushed the Kurdish uprising. That was led by the KDPI, the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran. not to be confused with the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iraq. They might have had the same history, but they diverged. And for the KDP, um, any the Kurds of Iraq have been caught on the crossfire, but I'm not sure neither the KDP or the other Kurdish party, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, just wants to have anything to do with a collapsed Iran, or kind of helping the Kurds across the border. Um, then a second Kurdish conflict emerged with a branch of the Turkish PKK. Their Iranian branch launched an uprising a little bit after 2003, then again in 2005. And the Iranians basically thought this is the Bush administration pursuing, a hybrid war against us. And that was pushed down. So there's been a long history of unrest in Iranian Kurdistan. The Islamic Republic has been used to this kind of ethnic ethnic unrest. You've had it amongst the Arabs of Iran, you had it amongst the Baluchis. But these, all that kind of violence has been small, in nature. None of those kind of separate movements really had a wide following. And again, it also raises a specter. They could rise up, and the U.S. has a bad habit of abandoning ethnic groups when it doesn't serve their interests. And the most case in point, the Kurds of Syria, an American ally for more than a decade that fought ISIS tenaciously, and then they were given up overnight to the central Syrian government. So you have to understand all of these ethnic groups know this history. And that's always going to be a question. And, you also have to realize, even with all these ethnic groups, sure, there are Turkic Azerbaijanis, but you also have to realize both the president of Iran and the deceased supreme leader were also of Azeri origin, Azerbaijani origin. Why break away from the state when you essentially controlled it at the same time? You have to think about that. The Azerbaijanis are Shia, so and they're also mixed, and also there's a sense of Iranian identity that cuts across a lot of these ethnic markers. I mean, even the Reza Shah's family wouldn't be what we considered 100% ethnic Persian. This is something you have to keep in mind. There is a sense of Iranian identity at the same time.
Thank you. We've got a lot of questions here. I'd say 15 to 20, and we've got about 25 minutes left. There's an enormous question about whether this could lead to World War III, by joining together with the Ukraine-Russia war, or some intervention. With the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz, things are going to get really interesting here. And Washington is not in a position to determine this. But so I want to come back to this question toward the end. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I just wanted to say our Stephen Clary from UCSD Osher, a longtime patron of Sidwak, had a question. Shall we give the war is underway. What is the likely outcome of the decapitation of the cleric and clerical and military leadership of Iran? And this is my easy answer. And, I've been teaching at Osher again for more than a decade with UCSD. Again, it's anyone's guess. And, that's the most honest answer. Unlike Syria, unlike Iraq, unlike Yemen or Libya, I would argue that Iran's state and bureaucracy is a lot more resilient. And Stephen, I wanted to answer that just because I just remembered something. There was an Iranian opposition group known as the Mujahideen Khalik, who, when they tried to take over the Islamic Republic, they took a bomb and destroyed most of Iran's leadership with a single car bomb. During the days when the Islamic Republic was even trying to consolidate itself, they wiped out an entire generation of the Khomeini faction. And yet somehow the Khomeini faction that eventually consolidated and became the Islamic Republic, a lot of similarities with the Russian Revolution, was able to survive that. So, that precedent is always important to remember that this is a government that lost a lot of its leaders in the Iran-Iraq War, literally on the front lines. And somehow it's proved to be more resilient, I think, because it's had a longer history than its neighbors. So I'm talking about Iraq, Syria, Yemen, where basically if you decapitate, again, Libya, everything comes falling apart. So that's the way I would answer, that's the answer I would give you, Stephen. Sorry, David, I cut you off, but
No, no, it's all right because I think Susanna's question you did answer it in large degree. I want to move on to Mike Williams. Should the USA have declared war in 1979 when the Iranian students seized the American embassy, would that have resulted in a different regime and avoided the problems of the last 47 years?
Mike, that's a good question. You have to realize the students had taken over the embassy before, and Khomeini expelled them. The students took over the embassy again, and Khomeini was about to expel them until he realized how popular the students were. We also have to remember, why did the students take over the embassy? It was because Carter made the fatal flaw of allowing the Shah in for medical treatment. We have to remember this. And we also have to remember the way the Islamic Republic would have gone wasn't necessarily, it didn't have to, it wasn't necessarily a predetermined outcome. And when I say that, it is, there were a good number of factions within Iran vying for power. It basically, Khomeini latched on with the students who took over the embassy to kind of outflank a couple of rivals. A couple of rivals who really did want to basically resume ties with the US, you see. And if you know that historical context, then yeah, no, declaring war would have made no sense because I think the US government still held hope of continuity with the new Iranian government. And I think so, no, declaring war would have not made a difference. I mean, Carter would have never wanted to do that because I think everyone in the Carter administration still held out hope that Iran could be, the new government could remain as an ally.
Got it. Thank you. And of course, that was still the Cold War and Iran having a border with the
Soviet,
Soviet
yeah,
Union. It would
yeah,
have been an
exactly.
interesting how to manage that particular track. Um, I'm trying to get a handle on Artemis's question here.
Oh, Artemis, I could answer that question for you with an art. And I hate to do this, I'll just do it with an article. I'm just going to find it. Yeah, what was the 2003 grand bargain? I've written about this and I could just
Okay.
give you a link in the chat. So Dave, why don't you go ahead and find another question for me?
All right. Can you discern any long, middle, and short-term intentions for Trump's actions?
No, because yeah, that suggests a long. Uh, no, I can't. I don't see any. That's what I'm saying. I don't see any long term. Instead of touting one of my works, let me just find Bloomberg, and they'll give you the answer, Artemis, and I'll just put it in the chat. Lexing. Yeah, here's an article from Bloomberg just to show this isn't my bias. I'll give them. Let's see, how do I do this? Okay, so Artemis, I'm going to answer you live, and let me see.
You may
Oh no,
need to gift it if
I
if
can
you're
answer it
yeah.
themselves. There we go. And let me see, did that go through or did I? Oh, chat is disabled. Okay, then let me, yeah, if you Google, okay, then I have to be shameless and show you an article I had written. It's Ibrahim al-Marashi and Al Jazeera. This was what I wrote when Trump withdrew from the deal. So you want to Google this? Trump is not only ditching I love that picture of Trump, the Iran deal, but Iraq too. And then here you have a whole section on the 2003 Iranian grand bargain. There, to answer your question, Artemis. Um,
Then you can follow up either Google or AI on that. There's a lot of stuff out there on this.
and Artemis, I'm assuming you're of Armenian heritage as well. So this is kind of involving your neighborhood.
Well, there you go. All right. Yeah, hot neighborhood right now. Question from Jim Larimore. Could the Islamic Republic of Iran become just the Republic of Iran as a result of the current events?
Yeah, James, I'm thinking about that as well. I've thought about that scenario as well. And some say it was already that way anyway before this war started. And when the attempts to reverse the hijab ban, or I'm sorry, attempt to reverse wearing the hijab, for example, taking the religious police, those enforcers, there used to be religious police, off the streets. I think it could have occurred had it not been for this attack. I think Iran was on that way. Let's not forget there are other Islamic republics. Pakistan is an Islamic republic. It's in its title. It was an Islamic republic much before Iran was. And I think Iran, might have gone maybe slowly and incrementally towards the direction of Pakistan. Of course, James, you're asking a profound question, though. And let me put it this way. I always do this exercise for my students is, how to imagine an Islamic Republic. Well, I say, let's imagine hypothetically we're in a Catholic Republic. How would my university classroom would be different? There would be a class with a cross in it. I would probably be a priest. And if we lived in a Catholic Republic, our leaders, for the most part, would be archbishops. Okay. And if we were in a Catholic Republic, the Pope would be our leader. And it's hard to think that the Pope would be our leader because the Pope doesn't get elected, but a Catholic Republic would have the Pope as our leader. And then alongside the president, you see, that's what a Catholic Republic would be like. Then I tell the students it's not hard to imagine because the Pope at one time used to rule a political entity known as the Papal States, right? But nevertheless, when I use this hypothetical example, then I just said, imagine our Catholic Republic and imagine what would the Catholic world do if somebody killed the Pope. Okay. Now you have to understand with the Islamic Republic of Iran, it's the same thing. Imagine a bunch of archbishops ruling. But the thing is, Shia Islam doesn't have a position like the Pope. You see, they don't have a single central position. And so that's what was Khomeini's innovation, so to speak. He created a position for himself that was like a Shia Pope. And then his successor was Khamenei as that kind of next Pope. But still, the analogy only could go so far. But still, the idea that imagine if you killed the Pope in a Catholic Republic, how would the Catholic world respond? Okay. Not all Catholics like our current Pope, right? But it's the Pope, right? Not all Catholics like Pope Francis and his progressive attitudes, but he's still the Pope. Okay, so imagine if you killed the Pope in a Catholic Republic, how would Catholics respond? And you just have to use that to understand how Shias around the world would respond to the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei, the spiritual and supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It is an event that absolutely transcends Iran's borders.
Interesting. The next question, how will peace be achieved when no one is following the international law? For example, the International Court of Justice and the role of the United Nations. The UN seems to be completely out of the picture.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, when you ask this, I always think, did Putin at one time ever have intelligence where Zelensky was and was ever tempted to take him out? And, I'm thinking now with the case of Maduro and this assassination of Khamenei, such a scenario is no longer unlikely. It was unthinkable That one country, takes out the head of another country in this rules-based order since 1945. I mean, that's one obvious example. And so to answer your question, it's much more elusive. It's much more elusive because peace only works when you think the other country is going to adhere to that peace. But I don't think anyone can believe that any deal with the U.S. now can endure as long as you have this particular president who is deliberately saying, "I'm rejecting the rules-based order. Okay, they don't mean anything to me." That doesn't bode well for peace. That doesn't bode well for multilateral organizations such as the UN. And let's not forget the other one, NATO. I mean, even NATO had a major rift over the Greenland dispute. So, yeah, I mean, there was another question, would World War III break out? I mean, World War II ended by the UN coming together. World War I ended by the League of Nations coming together. I can't imagine, the League of Nations came about because you had an American president named Woodrow Wilson who really believed in multilateral organizations. The US really believed in the UN. Under Roosevelt, this is the thing you have to understand. The UN was the unofficial name of the Allies. I'm sorry, the other way around. It was the official name. The unofficial name was the Allies. The UN was really Churchill and Roosevelt really believed in the United Nations. That was a World War II alliance. Okay. If this war were to end anytime soon, Trump is not a Roosevelt. He's not a Wilson. He does not believe in multilateral organizations to bring peace, you see. So it's not a surprise he's skeptical about the UN as well. And this does not bode well for these, international organizations that are meant to prevent wars like this from breaking out. Colin Powell, remember when my document was plagiarized, he was at the UN General Assembly trying to get the UN to go along. The first Gulf War was done under UN Security Council resolution. It was the UN that told Saddam to withdraw from Kuwait by 1991, January. The 2003 Iraq War, Bush didn't get that UN resolution, but he tried at least. And he had at least a British alliance. This is completely different. This was a surprise, secret, bilateral attack arranged by Israel and the U.S.
And having two major attacks by the U.S. in the middle of negotiations certainly doesn't help.
That's also a very important point.
Ali Larijani, who's a serious heavyweight in Iran and will have a major role to play in how things roll forward, has made it clear that the Iranians are not interested in negotiations. So that'll be interesting to go. Moving on to the next question, and this is getting into some big stuff here. Iran's counterattacks and striking their neighbors. Iran has hit 8 different countries. All of these countries are sources of energy, oil and natural gas for the global market. What would be the regional implications of this?
So I think that was asked by Professor.
This is Shiny.
Yes, this is our professor and fellow CIDRAC board member, as well as
yes.
CSU and USD. So thank you for the question. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. Remember back in 2008 when Bush was putting pressure on the Islamic Republic? The price of oil, surpassed $100 a barrel. It was unprecedented. That was just with the specter of war. Now war has broken out. And so, we have to wait to see, but never has the Straits of Hormuz really been, for all intents and purposes, closed. Right. Let's not forget this isn't also about petroleum. Liquefied natural gas in Qatar has also been attacked. And at the same time, let's not forget China, who's witnessed now 2 of its oil suppliers, Venezuela and Iran, kind of go offline for it as well. So, you also have the Chinese equation. China gets this oil from a lot of places, not just from Iran, but it gets this oil primarily from the Gulf, you see. That's the thing. So of course, you're talking about a major question, and it's of course not only the global economy. Um, this is usually what determines how people vote, and if there's going to be midterm elections, it's crazy to say this, that we even question, will there be a midterm elections going forward? But this is, if this were to extend, this could affect the midterm elections as well. Remember, it was I can't even remember because it seems like so long ago. Was it the price of eggs that really got Trump elected? It seems so, even though now
Had
I'm
a
getting,
role. Yeah.
things are moving so fast. So let's not forget Carter. One of the reasons Carter lost was, oil, the price of oil skyrocketed after the 79 revolution, and oil went offline. So yeah, the question you're asking is huge, and it's still too early to see what the outcomes and the effects will be.
Yeah, it's an avalanche that has just gotten started here. I have a lot to say on that, but I'm going to come back. I'm going to deal with the questions here. Another question, could the Iranian leadership be pushed into going for nuclear weapons as a result of the current events?
I mean, if I was the Iranian leadership, I would absolutely want them. It would make sense. But the big question is, can they now? Back in the summer of 2025, before we knew how much damage was done, and we really still don't know. I mean, I basically said the US pushed Iran to now, get it. There's no more stopping when you've hit rock bottom. In other words, you're fighting for your survival. If I was a rational actor, I would seek nuclear weapons. Can Iran do it? And this was also the major question. Did Khamenei really prevent Iran from getting them? We'll never know now because he's dead. But I mean, now will his successor have that restraint? And now I'll tell you why. Khamenei, he had issued, remember, he is like Pope of Iran at the same time. He issued a religious ruling forbidding Iran from getting those weapons. It's also forgotten. I mean, I could talk so much about that. Was that genuine? Was that binding? Again, now it's a mute question because he's dead. So we don't know what the next leadership would do. But I mean, what I tried to do in this lecture was just put myself in the Iranian perspective, going back to the Iran-Iraq War, the chemical weapons, the downing of the aircraft. And again, just from a rational perspective, if I was in their shoes and looked at North Korea, I would have said, yes, absolutely, it makes sense to get them.
Another question coming, and this I would include within the context of there were enormous economic problems, pressures on the Iranian population, in addition to the environmental issues, water, but power, fuel, etc. The inflation and the idea of regime change. So you change the regime, you still have all these problems to solve, and so how viable would any future regime be in that context? But this is an interesting question. What political options are likely to be available to Iranians in the near term?
I think that's the great question going forward. It's still too early to tell. Um, we're only in day 4 of this conflict. I mean, it feels a lot longer. But again, as a historian, I have to express kind of humility looking into the future uh, in all of this. Yeah, and just admit that, I don't have the answer. And I think if anyone has a definitive answer, that's a great indication they're not a real expert on this conflict.
Can the Shah's son come back to power?
That's been talked about. We saw what happened when the US tried to bring back Iraqi exiles to rule Iraq after 2003, exiles who hadn't been in the country for a long time. Um, so, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of nostalgia, even I assume of Iranians, of, what Iran was under the Shah, but there's no guarantee his son would be any better or is in touch. And, I have to be honest, and I think a lot of Iranians realize this. The current person in exile also curried a lot of favor with Israel. And I think Iranians are not going to accept a Shah who really basically would be seen as an Israeli puppet. The Shah's, I mean, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had good relations with Israel. But he did that on an equal footing. And, he often was critical of the Israeli and Jewish lobby in Washington. Okay, so he had relations, but he wasn't subservient. This Shah, I think, would be perceived by the Iranians as an Israeli puppet. After Israel has been involved in two waves of attacks, I'm not sure how Iranians in Iran would perceive him. Of course, Iranians in diaspora, of course, adore him. And of course, they're channeling, a lot of nostalgia before 1979. I didn't have time to show it, but I did have that Iran video has a lot of footage from, the Shah's period, and it evokes nostalgia. But does nostalgia make for good leadership, you see? So yeah, I don't think that. Sure, a lot of people imagine it. Is it viable for a long-term future in Iran? I don't think so. You know.
Well, we got barely 2 minutes here to finish off. There's a question about whether you see whether American and Israeli militaries might attack another Middle Eastern country, Turkey, for example. But I actually want to go to this last question. As a transactionalist, isn't Trump jumping in to take advantage of Iran's weakness and disarray for his own political objectives without any long-term or medium-term goals that might justify the U.S. action? What do you think about that?
I mean, I think that was his policy, thinking he could repeat Venezuela. And yes, Trump is a transactionalist. And now the only way he'll stop the war is if he could sell to the Americans that I got the transaction I wanted. I have this to show for it. And this is what's scary because, Putin could never stop the war in Ukraine unless he could go to the Russian people and say it was worth it. This is what I bring you from these 4 years of war. Okay. And so this is the question now. What transaction can Trump claim that, look at this deal I got. It was worth it. And that's what's scary is I can't imagine what he could do to basically say, I got this transaction. It's worth it. Trump basically said with Maduro gone, look at all this oil we're getting our hands on. There you go. Transaction done.
So we come back to the earlier question. Do you feel that you have any thoughts about whether the U.S. or Israeli militaries might attack another Middle Eastern country, or has this splash been so big?
What's left? I mean, again, it would be Yemen, but Yemen under the Houthis, Hezbollah is already being attacked. But what country is left? It's every country practically. I mean, we're talking about from Libya to Syria has faced some kind of military action. There's really nothing left, and that instability has. Some say this is Israel's long-term design. Yeah, but anyway, yeah, Lebanon is, of course, let's not forget there's another war zone going on there. Thank you,
Yeah.
Patricia. Let's not forget how precarious that country's situation is. Yeah.
Yeah. Ibrahim, I mean, we can keep going on this, and obviously there's going to be opportunities to deal with this topic going forward. I don't see this shutting down
On
in a
my
hurry.
behalf, thank you to Sidwak and Catherine Greenberg for putting this together so quickly. I suggested it on Saturday. Here we are, and we got it up and going. And I think as a civil society organization, one of the few in San Diego, I am grateful to Sidwak for bringing us together. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you're benefiting from Sidwak's organization.
Well, thank you, members of the audience, for joining. Ibrahim, thank you for your time, attention, and perspective. Enjoy, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.